the rain had already soaked through the pavement before the day truly began, turning the narrow street into a dull mirror that reflected a life worn thin by routine. And inside a small terraced house a woman sat awake long before the rest of the neighborhood stirred, her coat still on from the night before because warmth was something she rationed carefully. She had not slept properly, she rarely did anymore, and the faint light coming through the window caught the tired lines on her face as she stared at the kettle, waiting for it to boil even though she already knew there would be no tea this morning. The cupboard behind her was almost empty, the familiar hollow space where food should have been greeting her with the same quiet truth it had offered for months, and yet she moved with calm precision, as if pretending that order could stand in for comfort. Upstairs, her son slept, curled on his side beneath a thin blanket that had lost its softness years ago, his breathing uneven but steady, and she listened to it from below the way some people listen to music, counting each rise and fall as reassurance that the night had passed without taking anything else from her. She had learned to live like this, in fragments, in careful decisions that always leaned toward his comfort and away from her own. When the kettle clicked off, she poured the hot water into a mug and let it sit untouched, using the steam to warm her hands instead of drinking it. Then she moved quietly through the house, straightening what little there was to straighten, folding clothes that no longer fit properly, wiping a table that had not seen a proper meal in days. By the time her son came downstairs, she had already composed her face into something softer, something safer, something that suggested normality rather than struggle. She handed him a bowl with the last of the cereal, measured so precisely that it almost felt deliberate rather than desperate, and she sat opposite him with her empty mug, nodding gently as he ate, her eyes never leaving his hands as they moved. Outside, buses passed, tires hissing against wet roads, commuters wrapped in coats hurried toward stops and stations, their lives unfolding on schedules that had nothing to do with hers. When her son left for college, she watched from the doorway until he disappeared at the corner, his backpack hanging loose on his shoulders, one strap frayed where it had been repaired too many times, and only when he was gone did she allow her shoulders to drop. She locked the door behind her and began the walk toward the houses where she cleaned, her shoes letting in water through a crack she kept meaning to fix but never could. The work was the same every day, rooms that smelled of polish and fabric softener, surfaces that shone too brightly, families whose lives left no space for noticing the woman who scrubbed their floors. She worked quietly, methodically, accepting what was handed to her and never asking for more, because asking had taught her disappointment long ago. During a brief break she sat on a step at the back of one house and looked at her phone, not for messages but for the time, calculating again whether the money she would earn that week could stretch far enough to cover food, rent, electricity, and the small college fees she pretended not to worry about. Her fingers hovered over the screen before she put the phone away, knowing the numbers would not change no matter how long she stared at them. By the time she finished for the day, her back ached and her hands burned from cleaning products, but she walked home at the same steady pace, stopping at a shop window to glance at shoes she could not afford, imagining briefly how it might feel for her son to walk without watching every step. The thought lingered longer than she intended, and she shook it away before continuing on, unwilling to let imagination turn into regret. That evening her son returned later than usual, his face pale beneath the streetlight as he unlocked the door. She noticed immediately, the way mothers notice things others miss, the slight tension in his shoulders, the heaviness in his movements, but she said nothing, because silence had become their shared language. They ate together, a simple meal stretched as far as it could go, and when he went upstairs she sat alone at the table, listening to the house settle, to the pipes knocking, to the distant sound of a television from a neighbor's flat. Over the following weeks, small changes crept in, almost invisible at first. Her son began leaving earlier in the mornings, returning later at night, his eyes carrying something unreadable when she caught him watching her. She noticed money appearing occasionally in the house, notes folded neatly on the counter, always explained away by vague gestures, and she told herself not to question it too closely because relief had a way of dulling curiosity. Her own health began to falter quietly, the kind of decline that does not announce itself loudly enough to demand attention. She grew more tired, her breath shorter, her hands unsteady when she tried to lift heavy buckets, but she hid it well, resting only when she was certain no one could see. One night she woke coughing, her chest tight, the sound sharp and frightening in the quiet house. She sat on the edge of the bed until it passed, pressing a hand to her ribs, steadying herself before lying back down. She did not go to the doctor, she did not tell anyone, because she had learned that problems ignored sometimes stayed quiet longer. The money continued to appear. Enough to ease the worst of the worry, enough to buy proper groceries, enough to pay bills without the familiar knot in her stomach. She felt grateful and uneasy in equal measure, watching her son carefully, trying to read answers in the spaces between his movements. He grew thinner, quieter, his smile rarer, but whenever she tried to catch his eye he would look away, already halfway out of the room, already carrying something she could not reach. Then one afternoon he did not come home. Evening fell, the light outside dimmed, and she sat waiting, the minutes stretching into something heavy and unfamiliar. When the door finally opened, it was not him who stood there but a neighbor, her face pale, her words slow and careful, her eyes refusing to meet the mother's. The world narrowed instantly, sound fading into a dull hum as she followed the neighbor without fully understanding where they were going, her coat pulled over her shoulders with shaking hands. The building they entered smelled of antiseptic and cold air, the kind of place where hope moved cautiously. She walked down corridors that felt too long, too bright, her footsteps echoing back at her until she reached a room where her son lay on a narrow bed, machines humming softly beside him. His skin looked grey under the lights, his eyes closed, his face older somehow, as if exhaustion had carved something permanent into it. She stood frozen at the doorway, unable to step closer, her breath caught somewhere between fear and understanding. Over the next hours, time lost its shape. She learned without being told what he had done, how he had given more than he should have, how he had made a choice quietly and deliberately, believing it was the only way. The money, the groceries, the bills paid on time, all of it came together into a truth she had never allowed herself to consider. She sat by his bed, watching the slow rise and fall of his chest, her hands clenched in her lap, replaying every moment she had smiled through hunger, every time she had hidden her pain, every silent lesson she had taught without meaning to. When his eyes finally opened, briefly, weakly, she leaned forward instinctively, stopping herself just short of touching him, afraid that contact might shatter what little control she had left. He looked at her, really looked, and in that moment she saw not guilt or fear but something closer to relief, as if he believed he had finally balanced a scale that had been tipping too long. The weight of that understanding pressed down on her chest harder than any illness ever had. He did not stay long after that. The room fell quiet in a way she had never known, a silence that felt absolute, final, leaving no space for denial. When it was over she remained seated, unmoving, long after others had come and gone, until the night staff gently guided her away, their hands light but insistent. Days passed without meaning. The house felt wrong without him, every sound too loud or too absent. She found his backpack where he had left it, his shoes by the door, worn exactly to the shape of his feet. She held them once, sitting on the floor, and the memory of his careful steps through the world cut deeper than she expected. Life did not stop for her grief. Bills still arrived, work still waited, buses still passed her street each morning. She returned to cleaning houses, moving through rooms filled with other people's lives, carrying her loss quietly, the same way she had carried everything else. At night she sat alone at the table, the kettle boiling for no one, the mug cooling untouched, listening to the rain against the window, understanding finally what her love had taught him. She had given everything to protect him from pain, and in doing so she had shown him that love meant erasing himself. The realization settled slowly, relentlessly, not as a lesson but as a permanent weight she would carry for the rest of her life, in the silence of a house that would never feel full again.